The first time Celeste Moreau touched the piano in the east wing of the Ferraro estate, she did not mean to play. She had been cleaning the room, dusting the bookshelves, polishing the dark wood paneling, wiping down the marble surfaces that collected dust, the way abandoned rooms always do, as if neglect were a substance that settles on everything patience cannot reach. The piano sat in the center of the room beneath a chandelier that had not been lit in 18 months, covered in a dust cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old grief. She had lifted the cloth to clean underneath it and found a Steinway grand piano so beautiful that the sight of it stopped her hands mid-motion. She knew this piano, not this specific instrument, but this breed of piano, this lineage. She had spent 7 years at the Conservatoire de Lyon studying classical piano before her mother's illness had pulled her out of France and into a series of increasingly desperate circumstances that had carried her, eventually, across borders and through jobs and through the kind of quiet desperation that does not announce itself but simply accumulates, like dust on an abandoned piano, until the weight of it changes the shape of your life entirely. She had been a pianist of extraordinary promise. Her professors had used words like prodigious and generational. She had performed at recital halls where the acoustics were designed by architects who understood that sound is a form of architecture, that music builds rooms inside rooms, that a note played in the right space can make a person feel housed in something beautiful even when their actual life offers no such shelter. That had been another life. This life, the one she inhabited now at 27, was the life of a woman who cleaned houses. Specifically, who cleaned this house, the sprawling coastal estate of Dante Ferraro, a man whose name was spoken in this city the way weather is spoken of, as a force that could not be controlled, only endured or avoided. She had taken the job 3 months ago through an agency that did not ask questions and paid in cash, and she worked the night shift, because the night shift paid more and because Dante Ferraro preferred that his domestic staff be invisible, a preference that suited Celeste perfectly because invisibility was the skill she had perfected more thoroughly than any Chopin etude. She should not have lifted the dust cloth. She should not have looked at the piano. She should not have sat down on the bench that was still adjusted to the height of someone much shorter than her. A child's height, she realized, and she absolutely should not have placed her fingers on the keys. But she did all of these things, one after another, the way a person walks toward a cliff edge, not because they want to fall, but because the view is irresistible. She played one note, a single middle C that rang through the empty room like a bell in a church that had forgotten it still had a voice. The sound was pure and clear, and it resonated in her rib cage and traveled down her spine and settled in the place behind her sternum where she had stored 7 years of music that she had not played since leaving Lyon. Since her mother's diagnosis, since the scholarship evaporated and the recital halls closed their doors, and she discovered that the distance between prodigious and impoverished was exactly the width of one hospital bill. She played another note, and another, and then her hands remembered what her mind had been trying to forget, and she was playing. Not the Chopin or the Rachmaninoff or the Debussy that she had performed in concert halls, but something simpler, something softer, a lullaby. She did not know why her fingers chose this particular melody. It was an old French lullaby that her mother had hummed to her as a child, and her fingers found it on the keys the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape. Naturally, inevitably, following the path of least resistance towards something essential. She played for 11 minutes. She knew this because she looked at her watch when she stopped. Startled by her own audacity, by the realization that she had just played an unauthorized piano in the home of a man who could end her employment and possibly her physical safety with a single phone call. She replaced the dust cloth. She finished cleaning the room. She locked the door behind her and continued her shift, polishing silver and mopping marble floors and pretending that her hands were not still vibrating with the memory of the keys, that her chest was not still resonating with the sound of a lullaby, played on a dead child's piano in a dark house at midnight. She did not know that Dante Ferraro was in his study on the other side of the wall. She did not know that his study shared a wall with the East Wing music room, a design choice made by an architect who had understood that Dante's daughter Valentina liked to practice piano while her father worked, that the sound of her playing was the soundtrack to his evenings, that the muffled music through the wall was the thing he listened to instead of silence, when the numbers on his screen blurred and the weight of his operations pressed down on him like a physical force. She did not know that when she played that lullaby, an old French lullaby that happened to share the same melody as an Italian cradle song that Valentina had loved, that Valentina had played every night before bed, that Valentina had played on this very piano the evening before the fever took her to the hospital for the last time. Dante Ferraro had been sitting at his desk with a glass of whiskey and a loaded gun and a very specific kind of darkness in his mind, and the sound of that lullaby through the wall had made him set the gun down and press his forehead against the wood paneling and weep for the first time in 18 months. Valentina Ferraro had died 17 months ago. She was 7 years old. She had dark curly hair and her father's deep brown eyes and a laugh that sounded like someone had distilled sunlight into sound and poured it into a child-sized body. She had been learning piano since she was 4, and by 6 she was playing pieces that children twice her age struggled with, not because she was pressured, but because the piano was her joy, her language, the medium through which she expressed the enormous emotional capacity that lived inside her small frame. The illness had come without warning, a fever that would not break, a diagnosis that sounded like a foreign language, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, delivered in a hospital room where the fluorescent lights made everyone look like they were already grieving. Dante had spent every resource, called every favor, flown in specialists from 3 countries. He had sat beside her hospital bed for 41 days, holding her small hand in his large, scarred one, watching the monitors and the IV lines and the slow, terrible diminishment of a child who had been so full of life that the universe seemed to be making a mistake, seemed to be subtracting from the wrong column. She died on a Tuesday morning in March. She had been asking for music, and a nurse had played a recording of the lullaby on her phone, and Valentina had closed her eyes and smiled, and Dante had watched the monitors flatten and had understood that the world was capable of cruelty so profound that no amount of power or money or violence could shield you from them. He was a man who controlled territories and commanded armies and made decisions that altered the fates of hundreds of people. And he could not save a 7-year-old girl from dying in a hospital bed with a lullaby playing on a phone speaker. After Valentina's death, Dante had locked the East Wing music room. He had covered the piano with a white cloth. He had removed the framed photographs of Valentina from the common areas of the house and placed them in a box in his study closet. Not because he wanted to forget, but because seeing her face in passing, on a hallway table, on a mantelpiece, triggered a grief so violent and so sudden that it compromised his ability to function, and functioning was the only thing keeping the rest of his world from collapsing. His wife, Gabriella, had left 6 months after Valentina's death, not because she stopped loving him, but because grief had turned their marriage into a sealed room where 2 people suffocated on the same stale air, neither able to open a window because the fresh air outside reminded them of the child who used to play in it. Gabriella had moved to her sister's house in the countryside and sent him letters that he read but could not answer, because answering would require putting his feelings into words, and his feelings were not words. They were a black hole at the center of his chest that consumed everything: language, hope, the ability to imagine a future that was not simply an extension of this unbearable present. Dante ran his organization on autopilot. He made decisions. He attended meetings. He maintained the network of alliances and operations that constituted his empire. But the men who worked for him noticed the change. The boss who had been strategic and sharp and capable of a charisma that inspired loyalty had become mechanical, efficient, but hollow, a machine that performed the functions of leadership without the spark that had made him exceptional at it. His second in command, a man named Giancarlo Ferretti, handled the day-to-day operations with increasing autonomy, and the other lieutenants watched and waited and wondered how long a man could run an empire on grief alone before the grief won. The gun in his desk drawer was not new. He had always kept a weapon in his study, but the frequency with which he found himself taking it out, holding it, feeling the weight of it in his hand, while he sat alone in the dark and listened to the silence on the other side of the wall, where music used to be, that was new. That was the grief finding a shape, an exit strategy, a solution that he knew was no solution at all, but that beckoned with the seductive simplicity of ending. And then, on a Tuesday night at midnight, 3 months after Celeste Moreau began her employment as a night maid in the Ferraro estate, the silence on the other side of the wall ended, and a lullaby began. Celeste rode the bus home that first morning as the sun cracked the horizon over the coastal city, turning the sea into a sheet of hammered copper and the buildings into dark silhouettes against a sky that was too beautiful for how she felt. She shared the bus with early shift workers, dock laborers with calloused hands, hospital nurses with exhausted eyes, restaurant staff heading to prep kitchens, and she sat among them with her cleaning uniform under her coat and her mother's gold chain against her collarbone and her fingers tingling with the phantom sensation of piano keys. And she felt like a spy, like someone living undercover in a life that did not belong to her. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in the immigrant quarter, a neighborhood of narrow streets and laundry lines and the mingled smells of cooking from 6 different countries. She shared 2 rooms with Amara, a Ghanaian nurse who worked days at a pediatric clinic, and Liu, a Chinese graduate student who was writing a thesis on maritime law, and who filled the apartment with textbooks and sticky notes and the quiet intensity of someone who was going to succeed through sheer force of will. They were kind to each other in the way that people who share cramped spaces learn to be kind, through small gestures of consideration rather than grand declarations of friendship. Amara left coffee ready for Celeste when she came home from her night shift. Liu organized the bathroom schedule on a whiteboard. Celeste cleaned the kitchen because she could not stop cleaning, because her hands needed to be doing something, because the alternative was sitting still and thinking about all the things she had lost. She called her mother every other day. The calls were getting harder. Maman remembered less each time. Last week she had asked Celeste whether she had practiced her scales, as if Celeste were still 12, as if the conservatory were still ahead of her instead of behind her. And Celeste had said, "Yes, Maman, I practiced," and the lie had tasted like ash in her mouth. The care facility in Marseille sent monthly reports written in the careful clinical language that medical professionals use to describe the dismantling of a human mind, and Celeste read them on the bus to work and filed them in a folder she kept under her mattress and never looked at again. She was surviving. That was the word she used. Not living. Living implied forward motion, intention, the expectation that tomorrow would be different from today. She was surviving, which meant paying the bills and keeping the apartment clean and eating meals that she cooked because cooking was cheaper than buying and sending money to Marseille, and riding the bus to the Ferraro estate every evening, and cleaning rooms that were already clean because the day staff had been through them, and the entire enterprise of her existence was a kind of maintenance, a holding pattern, a life lived in the gap between who she had been and whatever came next, if anything came next at all. Celeste came back to the piano the next night. She told herself she would not. She cleaned the 2nd floor bathrooms and the library and the long hallway with the marble floors that reflected her shadow like a dark twin walking beneath the surface of the stone, and she told herself that she would skip the East Wing entirely, that she would clean it on another night, that the risk of playing again was too great. But her hands ached for the keys the way a body aches for water after days without it, and the piano was right there, behind a door she had the key to, in a room no one entered, at an hour when the house was supposed to be asleep. She played for 20 minutes the second night, the same lullaby and then another. A Brahms piece that she had learned at the conservatory, simplified and softened into something that sounded less like a performance and more like a conversation, as if the piano were an old friend she was catching up with after years of silence. She kept the volume low, her touch delicate, the sustain pedal barely engaged, creating a sound that was intimate and contained, a music that existed only in the immediate space of the room and, though she did not know this, in the study next door where a man in a dark suit sat with his eyes closed and his forehead against the wall and felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked tight since March. The third night, she played Debussy. Clair de Lune, the piece that every piano student learns and that most play competently, and that very few play the way Celeste played it, which was with the understanding that the piece is not about moonlight, but about longing, about the gap between what the world shows you and what you feel, about the particular sadness of beauty observed from a distance by someone who is not sure they will ever be close enough to touch it. On the other side of the wall, Dante Ferraro listened. He did not investigate. He did not check the security cameras, though the estate had dozens of them, and any member of his staff could have pulled the footage in minutes. He did not ask his head of security, a taciturn man named Bruno, to identify who was in the music room. He did not do any of the things that a man in his position should have done, because doing those things would mean acknowledging the music, and acknowledging the music might mean stopping it, and stopping it was the one thing he could not bear to do. The music was the first thing in 18 months that had made him feel something other than the black, compressed weight of loss. It was not happiness. It was not comfort exactly. It was something more fundamental than either. It was the reminder that beauty still existed, that somewhere on the other side of a wall, hands were touching keys and creating sound, and the sound was entering his body through his skin and his bones and his grief, and reaching the part of him that was still alive, the part that Valentina's death had not managed to kill, the part that the gun in the desk drawer had been designed to finish off. He set the gun in the bottom drawer. He locked the drawer. He put the key in a box on the highest shelf of his closet, behind a stack of financial documents that no one ever touched. It was not a decision to live exactly. It was a decision to listen first, to wait, to see if the music came back. It came back every night. If this story has already wrapped itself around your heart, if you can feel the weight of what Celeste doesn't know and the grief Dante carries in every silence, take a moment to subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. Hit that notification bell because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't expect. Celeste developed a routine. She would complete her cleaning duties for the East Wing last, finishing around midnight, and then she would sit at the piano and play for 30 to 40 minutes. She played everything she remembered from the conservatory: Chopin nocturnes, Satie gymnopédies, Schubert impromptus, Bach preludes that she simplified into something that sounded more like meditation than performance. And she always ended with the lullaby, the old French lullaby that her mother had hummed, that she had learned to play at age 5 before she could read music, that her fingers knew the way they knew the shape of her own face in the dark. She played with her eyes closed most of the time. The room was dark except for the moonlight through the tall windows that looked out over the coastal gardens and the sea beyond, and the darkness and the music together created a space that felt sacred, removed from the reality of her life. The cramped apartment she shared with 2 other women who worked cleaning jobs, the money she sent to her mother's care facility every month, the slow erosion of a talent that had once been her identity and was now her secret, her private grief, the thing she had lost that she could not stop reaching for. She did not know that on the other side of the wall, Dante Ferraro was building his evenings around her playing. He began coming to his study earlier, settling into his leather chair with paperwork he barely read, waiting for midnight the way a man waits for medication, for the thing that makes the pain bearable. He learned her repertoire. He could predict which pieces she would play based on patterns he had observed over weeks. She played Chopin when she arrived in a contemplative mood, Debussy when she was sad, Bach when she needed order, and the lullaby always, always last. The lullaby that was the melody his daughter had played on the same piano. The melody that he had listened to through the same wall. The melody that connected the living to the dead through the medium of a stranger's hands on familiar keys. He began to think of her as the ghost, not because he believed in ghosts, but because the music came from a room he had sealed as a tomb, played on an instrument he had silenced as a memorial, and the fact that someone had broken that silence without permission should have enraged him, but instead felt like a resurrection, like the room itself had decided it was done being dead, and had summoned someone to bring it back to life. 6 weeks into the nightly ritual, Dante broke his own rule and looked at the security footage. He did it at 3 a.m, alone in the security office on the ground floor, reviewing the camera feeds from the East Wing hallway. He watched a woman in a dark uniform, the standard issue clothing his cleaning agency provided, walk down the corridor with a mop and a bucket. She was tall and slender with deep brown skin and dark hair worn in an elaborate crown of braids that caught the overhead hallway light and turned it into geometry. She moved with an economy of motion that was unusual for a cleaning woman. There was something in the way she carried herself, a fluidity, a consciousness of her own body and space, that suggested training of some kind. Her hands, when they reached for the doorknob of the music room, were long-fingered and elegant, the hands of someone who had been trained to use them with precision. She entered the room. The interior camera, which Dante had not known still functioned, showed her in the moonlit space, moving through her cleaning routine with efficiency, and then, as if drawn by a gravitational force she could not resist, sitting down at the piano bench and placing her fingers on the keys. He watched her play. The security camera had no audio, so he watched in silence, but he could see the way her body moved with the music, the way her shoulders rose and fell with the phrasing, the way her eyes closed and her face took on an expression that he recognized because he had seen it on Valentina's face in the years before the illness. The expression of someone who was not playing music, but being played by it, who had surrendered to the instrument and become its voice rather than its operator. He watched the entire session, 37 minutes. When she finished with the lullaby, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, her head slightly bowed, and he could see, even through the grainy security footage, that she was crying. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical grief of someone performing emotion, but quietly, privately, the way people cry when they believe they are completely alone, and the tears are a conversation between themselves and whatever it is they have lost. Dante closed the security footage. He sat in the dark office for a long time. Then he went to his desk in the study and made a phone call to the cleaning agency. He did not fire her. He did not request her removal. He asked for her name. Celeste Moreau, the agency manager told him, reluctant to share employee information with a client, but unable to refuse Dante Ferraro anything. French national, arrived in the country 8 months ago. Clean record, good worker, no complaints. Celeste Moreau. He wrote the name on a piece of paper and placed it in the desk drawer where the gun had been, and the substitution felt symbolic in a way he did not examine too closely. He researched her, not through the channels he would normally use for investigating someone, the network of contacts and informants, and digital specialists who could dismantle a person's privacy the way a mechanic dismantles an engine. He researched her the old-fashioned way, through public records and internet searches and the digital trail that every person leaves behind like footprints in sand. He found the conservatory records. He found the recital programs from Lyon, her name listed among the performers, the reviews that called her exceptional, the scholarship announcement that had been the beginning of her professional life and whose revocation had been the end of it. He found the gap, the point where her digital presence went from promising young pianist to nothing, a cliff edge where the trail simply stopped, and he understood that the gap was where the disaster had occurred. Whatever it was, the thing that had taken a conservatory pianist and turned her into a cleaning woman in a foreign country. He did not fill in the gap. He could have. His resources were more than sufficient to reconstruct every moment of her life since the scholarship ended. But he chose not to, because the details of her suffering were not his to collect, and because he understood, with the particular empathy of a man who had lost everything that mattered, that the story of how you fell was private, sacred even, and that the only part that belonged to anyone else was the part where you stood back up. She was a concert pianist. She was cleaning his house at night and playing his dead daughter's piano at midnight and crying when she finished, and she did not know he was listening. The knowledge of this sat in his chest beside the grief and did something unexpected to the architecture of his pain. It did not diminish it. It expanded it, but in a direction he had not anticipated. Outward, toward someone else. Toward this woman who was also carrying a loss she could not put down, who had also been diminished by circumstances beyond her control, who was also finding in music the thing that the rest of life had failed to provide. The complication arrived in the form of Giancarlo Ferretti, Dante's second-in-command, who had been running the organization's daily operations with increasing confidence and decreasing deference to Dante's authority. Giancarlo was a practical man, 45 years old, with the build of a former boxer and the mind of an accountant. He had been loyal to Dante for 15 years, but loyalty in their world was a commodity whose value fluctuated with the strength of the leader, and Dante's strength had been visibly declining since Valentina's death. Giancarlo came to the estate one evening to review quarterly financials and arrived early, before Dante expected him. He heard the piano through the walls of the corridor outside the study and stopped, his broad face creasing with confusion and then suspicion. "Who's playing the piano?" he asked when Dante met him in the hallway. "I thought you locked that room." "The cleaning staff," Dante said, and his voice carried a warning that most men would have heeded. Giancarlo was not most men. "You're letting the cleaning staff play Valentina's piano?" Giancarlo's tone walked the line between disbelief and accusation. "Boss, that piano, you haven't let anyone touch it since—" "I'm aware of what I have and haven't done, Giancarlo. I'm just saying. The men talk. If they find out someone's been in that room, playing that instrument, they'll wonder if you're losing your edge. They already wonder, Dante. I'm telling you this as someone who's been by your side for 15 years. The grief. People understand it. But people also smell weakness the way wolves smell blood. And there are men in the organization who... Who what? Dante's voice dropped to the register that every man in his operation knew. The register that preceded violence. The frequency at which reasonable conversation ended and consequences began. Giancarlo held up his hands, a gesture of retreat. "I'm on your side, always, but the piano plays every night and people hear things, and I need to know what you want me to tell them." "Tell them nothing. The piano is not their concern. My grief is not their concern. And if anyone in this organization mistakes my loss for weakness, you can remind them of what happened to the last man who made that calculation." Giancarlo nodded and dropped the subject, but Dante saw the calculation behind his eyes, the assessment that even loyal men make when they watch a leader stumble, and he understood that his window was narrowing, that the grief-fueled paralysis that had defined the last 18 months could not continue without real consequences. The following night, Celeste almost did not play. She had encountered one of Dante's security men in the hallway outside the East Wing, a broad-shouldered man named Bruno, who had looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who catalogued threats for a living. He had not spoken to her, had not questioned her presence, had simply watched her pass with her cleaning supplies and continued on his route, but his gaze had reminded her of what she was, an employee in a dangerous man's house, a woman whose continued safety depended on remaining unremarkable, a person who absolutely should not be sitting at a piano at midnight, playing music that she had not been authorized to play. She cleaned the East Wing quickly, efficiently, and when she reached the music room, she cleaned it without lifting the dust cloth, without sitting at the bench, without touching the keys. She finished in 12 minutes and left and walked down the corridor and got as far as the staircase before she stopped. The ache in her hands was physical. Not pain exactly, but absence. The sensation of muscles and tendons that had been designed for a specific purpose being denied that purpose. The body's protest against the mind's reasonable caution. She stood at the top of the staircase and pressed her palms against the marble banister and felt the coolness of the stone and the emptiness of her fingers. And she thought about her mother in the care facility in Marseille, about the bills that arrived every month like clockwork, about the life she was living and the life she had lost, and the 30 minutes of music every night that was the only bridge between the two. She went back. She opened the door. She sat at the piano and played, and this time she played with a ferocity that she had not allowed before, a Chopin ballade that required the full range of the instrument, that filled the room with sound that was not gentle or contained, but enormous, overwhelming. The sound of a woman who was tired of being quiet, who was tired of being small, who was tired of the careful, diminished life she had been living and wanted, just for a few minutes, to be the person she had been trained to be, the person the conservatory had promised she could become. On the other side of the wall, Dante Ferraro pressed his palms flat against the wood paneling and felt the vibrations of the music through the structure of the house, and through the bones of his hands, and into his chest, and he closed his eyes and let the sound consume him. And for the first time since Valentina died, he felt something that was not grief and was not numbness, but was alive, raw, electric, the feeling of being in the presence of something extraordinary, and knowing that you are witnessing a private miracle. We're only halfway through this story, and everything is about to change. If you're already invested in Celeste and Dante, if you can feel the invisible thread between them through that wall, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling me which piece of music moves you the most. I read every single one. The next morning, Dante called the cleaning agency again, but he did not ask about Celeste. He asked them to change the schedule so that Celeste Moreau was permanently assigned to the Ferraro estate, night shift, indefinitely. The agency complied. They always complied. 7 weeks after the first night she played, they met. Not through the wall, not through security footage, not through the intermediary of music that traveled through plaster and wood, but in person, in the kitchen of the estate, at 2 a.m, in the particular intimacy that exists in large houses after midnight, when the only people awake are the ones who cannot sleep and the ones who clean. Celeste had finished her piano session and was making tea in the service kitchen, a habit she had developed, a small act of domesticity, in a house where nothing felt domestic, where everything was marble and dark wood and the sterile perfection of a space designed to impress rather than comfort. She had filled the kettle and was standing at the counter when a man walked in. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. The height, the breadth of shoulders, the way he filled the doorway like someone who had been built to occupy space. He wore dark trousers and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his forearms were thick and veined and bore the evidence of a physical life. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, thick and slightly disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it. His face was handsome in the way that weathered structures are handsome. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but possessed of a character that spoke of time and experience, and the particular gravity that comes from having survived things that were not meant to be survived. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they were rimmed with the kind of shadows that sleeplessness leaves behind. The bruised look of a man who lay in bed, staring at ceilings, and thinking about all the things that the darkness made louder. She knew who he was immediately. Everyone who worked in this house knew Dante Ferraro by sight, by reputation, by the careful deference with which the other staff spoke his name. He was the man who signed the checks. He was the man whose grief had turned a mansion into a mausoleum. He was the man whose daughter had played the piano that Celeste played every night. He looked at her with an expression she could not read. Surprised, perhaps, at finding someone in his kitchen at this hour, But underneath the surprise, there was something else, something that looked like recognition, which made no sense because they had never met, because she was supposed to be invisible, because the entire architecture of her employment was designed to ensure that they occupied the same space without ever occupying the same moment. "You're Celeste," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent a spike of ice through her stomach. Employers did not know the names of their night shift cleaning staff. Employers, who were also Mafia bosses especially, did not know those names unless something had gone wrong. "Yes, sir," she said. And her voice, which she had not used in hours, which she used less and less these days because her life offered fewer and fewer occasions for speech, came out rough and quiet and accented with the French that she had been trying to minimize, but that surfaced when she was nervous. "You don't need to call me sir. You're making tea." "I'm sorry, She reached for the kettle, preparing to leave, preparing to vanish back into the infrastructure of the house where she belonged. "I didn't say stop. I said you're making tea. Make 2 cups. She stared at him. He walked past her to the cabinet where the cups were kept. He knew his own kitchen, which surprised her, because she had assumed a man like him would not know where the cups were, would not enter a kitchen, would not exist in the service areas of his own home. He took down 2 cups, placed them on the counter beside her, and then leaned against the opposite counter with his arms crossed and watched her with those dark, sleepless eyes, and she felt simultaneously terrified and seen in a way she had not been seen in years. She made the tea. Her hands trembled on the kettle, and she was certain he noticed, but he did not comment. She handed him a cup, and their fingers did not touch, and the space between his hand and hers felt like a border crossing, like the gap between 2 countries that had not yet established diplomatic relations. He drank. She drank. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the sea through the closed windows and the ticking of a clock on the wall that counted seconds into an emptiness that neither of them seemed in a hurry to fill. Then he spoke. "My daughter played that lullaby." The cup in Celeste's hands went still. The tea stopped steaming. The clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking, or maybe it was just that time itself had paused to observe the detonation of a sentence that changed everything. She did not pretend she didn't know what he meant. She did not insult him with denial or feigned confusion. She stood in his kitchen with his tea in her hands and his dead daughter's music in her fingers, and she met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would be adequate to the weight of what he had just revealed. That he knew, that he had always known, that every night for 7 weeks she had been playing a dead child's piano, and he had been listening through the wall, and neither of them had acknowledged the other's existence until this moment in a kitchen at 2 a.m. "I know," she said finally, and the words were so small and so insufficient that they almost disappeared into the hum of the refrigerator. "How did you know the song?" His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to extracting information without revealing emotion. But she could hear the fracture beneath the control, the way the question trembled at its edges like a structure that had been weakened by years of pressure. "It's a French lullaby. My mother sang it to me. I've known it since I was small. I didn't know." She stopped. She didn't know what she didn't know. She didn't know that the song was his daughter's. She didn't know that the piano she played was a memorial. She didn't know that her music was being heard by someone on the other side of a wall. She didn't know any of the things that would have stopped her if she had known them, and she was not sure she would have stopped even then, because the piano was the only true thing left in her life, and taking it from her would have been like asking her to amputate her own hands. "You didn't know it was Valentina's," he finished for her, and the name on his lips, Valentina, carried a weight that Celeste could feel pressing against her own chest, a gravitational force of grief so dense that it warped the space around it. "No, I'm sorry. I should not have touched the piano. I know it was locked for a reason. If you say you'll stop playing, I will have to ask you to leave this house." His voice was quiet but absolute. "And I don't want to do that." She looked at him across the kitchen. He looked at her. And in the silence between them, in the gap where words had failed and the clock had resumed its counting, and the tea was growing cold in their hands, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with the earthquake force of a confession, but gently, the way a key turns in a lock that has been frozen for a long time, and finally, with patience and the right pressure, begins to move. After the kitchen, the rules changed. Celeste continued to play every night, but now she played knowing that she was heard, and the knowledge transformed the music. She had been playing for herself before, for the ache in her hands, for the memory of who she had been, for the comfort of the only language she truly spoke fluently. Now she was playing for an audience of one, a man she barely knew, a man whose grief she had accidentally become the custodian of, and the awareness of his presence on the other side of the wall gave her playing a dimension it had not had before. She played with intention. She played with care. She chose pieces not only for their beauty, but for their capacity to communicate something specific: comfort, companionship, the promise that silence was not the only option. Dante began leaving things on the piano. She would arrive at midnight to find a single rose in a small crystal vase on the music stand. A white rose, always white, and she would later learn that white roses had been Valentina's favorite because they looked like they were made of light. A week later, a new book of Chopin nocturnes appeared, the Henley Urtext edition that she had coveted at the conservatory, but could never afford, the pages crisp and unplayed, waiting for her fingers. A handwritten note on cream-colored paper that said simply, "The Debussy was beautiful tonight." She would read the note and feel her face flush in the dark room and place the note in the pocket of her uniform and carry it with her for the rest of the shift like a talisman, like proof that she existed as more than a woman with a mop and a bucket, that somewhere in this house a man was listening to her play, and the listening was a form of conversation, and the conversation mattered. She began leaving notes in return. She would write them on the backs of the cleaning supply invoices she carried in her uniform pocket, short messages in her careful handwriting. The Steinway needs a tuner, but she still has a beautiful voice. Tonight I played Satie. He wrote music for the furniture, background music, he said, but nothing this piano plays is background. I found a photograph of your daughter on the shelf. She had your eyes. I hope you don't mind that I dusted the frame. She would leave the notes on the piano bench where he would find them in the morning, in the exchange. His notes at midnight, hers at dawn, became a correspondence conducted in the margins of their separate lives, two people writing letters across the border of a wall that separated his grief from her music, and that was, note by note, becoming more transparent. They began meeting in the kitchen, not every night, perhaps twice a week, perhaps 3 times, always at 2 a.m, always with tea, always with the careful formality of two people who understood that whatever was growing between them existed in a space that had no name and no precedent. He would ask about the pieces she played, about the composers, about the technical demands of a Chopin etude versus a Debussy prelude, and she would explain with the precision and passion of a woman who had spent 7 years studying these questions and had no one to share the answers with. He told her about Valentina, not all at once, not in a flood, but in careful, measured portions, the way you feed someone who has been starving. Too much too fast could kill them, so you give them small amounts and watch them digest before offering more. He told her about the first time Valentina sat at the piano and played a scale with perfect intonation at age 4. He told her about the recital at her school where she played a simplified for Elise, and he sat in the audience surrounded by other parents and understood for the first time in his life what it meant to be proud of something pure, something untainted by the compromises and violence that defined the rest of his existence. He told her about the hospital, about the 41 days, about the lullaby on the phone speaker. Celeste listened. She did not offer platitudes or comfort or the well-meaning but ultimately useless assurances that people give to the grieving. She did not tell him that time heals, or that Valentina was in a better place, or that the pain would fade. She listened with the same quality of attention that she brought to music, total, focused, receptive, allowing the grief to enter her without resistance, holding space for it the way a concert hall holds space for sound. One night, he asked about her mother. She told him about the diagnosis, early onset dementia that had begun claiming her mother's mind at 53, stealing memories the way a fire steals oxygen, gradually and then all at once. About the care facility in Marseille that provided excellent treatment and cost more than Celeste had ever imagined spending in her life. About the scholarship at the conservatory that had been contingent on performance standards she could no longer meet, because she was flying to Marseille every other weekend instead of practicing, because her fingers were stiff from cleaning jobs she had taken to pay for her mother's care, because the music that had been her entire identity was being crowded out by the logistics of survival. "I didn't stop being a pianist," she said, and her voice was steady because she had learned to tell this story without breaking, the way soldiers learn to describe combat without flinching, through repetition and the careful construction of emotional calluses. "The world stopped letting me be one. There's a difference." Dante looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Play Rachmaninoff for me tomorrow night." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in his presence, and the sound surprised them both. Warm, genuine, slightly breathless, the laugh of a woman who had forgotten she was capable of it. "Rachmaninoff requires a piano that's been tuned recently. Yours hasn't been tuned in over a year." "I'll have it tuned." "You would tune a piano you locked as a memorial because a cleaning woman asked you to?" "You didn't ask. I offered. And you're not a cleaning woman. You're a pianist who cleans." The distinction mattered. She could feel it landing in her chest, rearranging something that had been disarranged for years. She was not a cleaning woman who happened to play piano. She was a pianist who happened to clean. The order of the words changed the architecture of her identity, and Dante Ferraro, a man who controlled territories through force and strategy, had done it with a single sentence. The piano was tuned 2 days later. A specialist arrived from the city, a small nervous man who clearly knew whose house he was in and whose piano he was tuning, and he worked for 4 hours under Bruno's watchful eye, and left with an envelope of cash and a story he would tell his wife about the Steinway in the Ferraro estate, the most beautiful instrument he had ever worked on, covered in a dust cloth in a room that smelled of grief. That night, Celeste played Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2, the opening movement, adapted for solo piano, and she played it with everything she had. Every hour of practice, every lesson at the conservatory, every ounce of the talent that her professors had called generational, all of it channeled through her fingers into the keys of a piano that sang under her touch like it had been waiting for this, like the tuning had not just adjusted the strings, but had woken the instrument from a long sleep, and the music that poured through the room and through the wall and into Dante Ferraro's study was not background noise, was not gentle consolation, was not the muffled lullaby of previous nights, but a full-throated declaration of who Celeste Moreau actually was, who she had been, who she would not allow the world to forget she could be. Giancarlo returned to the estate 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation. He came without invitation, which was itself a breach of protocol, and he brought with him 2 men that Celeste did not recognize. Hard-faced men in dark suits who stood in the entrance hall with the coiled stillness of people whose primary function was violence. Celeste was polishing the banister on the main staircase when they arrived. She heard the front door, the heavy oak door that she had cleaned the brass hardware on 100 times, open and close, and she looked down from the upper landing and saw Giancarlo crossing the marble floor with the confidence of a man who believed this house was already his. She pressed herself against the wall of the upper landing, and invisible in her dark uniform, and watched. Giancarlo went to Dante's study. The door closed. The two men remained in the entrance hall, their positions suggesting that they were not here for decoration. 45 minutes later, the study door opened and Giancarlo emerged. His face was tight, controlled, the expression of a man who has been denied something he expected to receive. He walked past the staircase without looking up. The two men fell in behind him. The front door opened and closed, and the house was silent again, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the rapid beating of Celeste's heart. She finished her shift. She did not play that night. The encounter on the staircase had reminded her, with a clarity that the kitchen conversations had softened, of exactly where she was and who these people were and what the stakes actually look like when they walked through a door in dark suits with violence in their posture. The next night, Dante was waiting in the kitchen when she came down from the east wing. His face was drawn, older than it had looked the last time she saw him, the silver at his temples more prominent against the dark. "You didn't play tonight," he said. "I saw Giancarlo and the men he brought." She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, not entering, maintaining the distance that she had allowed to close over weeks of tea and conversation and the dangerous intimacy of shared grief. "I'm not naive about what your life is. I've been careful not to ask questions, but those men were not here for a friendly visit, and I need to know if I'm in danger." Dante looked at her for a long time. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not the cold, strategic calculation of a man deciding whether to lie, but the agonized calculation of a man deciding how much truth another person could bear. "Giancarlo believes my grief has made me weak," he said. "He's not wrong. He wants to take control of the organization. He believes he's earned it through 18 months of running things while I was elsewhere." The last word carried the full weight of those 18 months, the locked room, the covered piano, the gun in the drawer, the nights of staring at walls and listening to silence. "Is he going to hurt you?" "Giancarlo is not stupid enough to move against me directly. Not yet. But he's consolidating support, and the men who follow me are watching to see whether I'm going to wake up or whether they need to transfer their loyalty to someone who's actually leading." "And are you going to wake up?" The question hung in the kitchen air. Dante looked at her, at this woman who had come into his house as a cleaning woman and become the keeper of his daughter's piano, and the first person in 18 months to ask him a direct question and expect an honest answer. "You made me lock the gun in the drawer," he said, and the admission cost him something visible, something that showed in the way his jaw tightened and his hands gripped the counter edge. "The first night you played, I had it out. I had it in my hand. And then the lullaby started through the wall and I put it down. You did that. You didn't know you did it, but you did." Celeste's hands went cold. The cup of tea she had been about to pour became irrelevant. The kitchen, the house, the entire structure of the careful distance she had been maintaining collapsed in a single sentence, because the man standing across from her had just told her that she had saved his life with a song she did not know anyone was listening to, and the weight of that knowledge was greater than anything she had ever carried, greater than her mother's illness, greater than the loss of her career, greater than the accumulated grief of 3 years of diminished living. "You can't tell me that," she whispered. "I can. I just did. And I'm telling you because I need you to understand that when I say, I don't want you to stop playing, it is not a request about music. It is something else entirely." The space between them. 3 meters of kitchen floor, the width of a counter, the distance between an employer and an employee, between a mafia boss and a cleaning woman, between a man who had almost died and the woman who had unknowingly stopped him. That space felt simultaneously enormous and infinitesimal, a distance that could be crossed in 2 steps, but that represented an entire landscape of consequence and complication. She crossed it. She walked across the kitchen floor, and she stood in front of him, and she put her hands, her pianist's hands, her cleaning woman's hands, her mother's daughter's hands, on either side of his face, and held him the way you hold something precious that is also dangerous, with firmness and with care. And she felt the roughness of his jaw and the heat of his skin and the fine tremor that ran through him. The tremor of a man who had been holding himself together through sheer will for 18 months and was, in this moment, in this kitchen, in the middle of the night, finally being given permission to stop. He did not kiss her. She did not kiss him. They stood in the kitchen holding each other's faces and looking into each other's eyes, and the moment was more intimate than any kiss because it was the moment before, the moment of decision, the moment when two people acknowledge that they are standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone. "Giancarlo will use me against you," she said. "If he finds out about this, about us, he'll use it." "Let him try." "That's not a strategy, Dante. That's bravado." "Then help me make it a strategy. You're the smartest person in this house, and you've been wasted on mopping floors. Help me figure out how to take back what's mine before Giancarlo takes it from me." She looked at this man whose face she held in her hands. This man who had almost ended his life on a Tuesday night and had been saved by a lullaby he didn't know she was playing, and she made a choice that was neither rational nor safe, nor anything that the woman who had arrived at this house 3 months ago with a mop and a bucket would have recognized as possible. "Okay," she said. "But first you're going to sit in the music room and listen to me play, not through the wall, in the room, the way music is supposed to be heard." She led him down the corridor to the east wing. She opened the door. She turned on the chandelier, the first time it had been lit in 18 months, and the light fell across the room and across the piano and across the photographs that were still on the shelf by the window, photographs of a dark-haired girl with enormous brown eyes sitting at this very piano, and Dante stopped in the doorway, and the grief hit him like a wave, like a wall of water, and his knees buckled, and Celeste caught his arm and held him upright and said, I know. But you need to come inside. You need to be in this room. She would want you to be in this room." He walked in. He sat in the armchair by the window, the chair where he used to sit while Valentina practiced. Celeste sat at the piano. She adjusted the bench. It was still set to a child's height, still the way it had been when Valentina last played, and she raised it and positioned herself and placed her fingers on the keys. She played the lullaby, not through a wall, not muffled by plaster and distance, but directly, openly, in the room where it belonged, and the sound filled the space and reached Dante without obstruction, and he sat in his daughter's practice chair and wept openly, freely, for the first time since the funeral, and Celeste played through his grief the way she had been trained to play through everything, with precision and beauty and the absolute conviction that music was not an escape from pain, but a way of moving through it, a path that led, not around the darkness, but directly through its center and out the other side. What followed was not a rescue. It was not a story about a man and us saving a woman or a woman saving a man. It was two people saving each other, simultaneously, through the only means available to them: presence, honesty, and the shared understanding that grief does not require a solution, only a witness. Dante returned to his organization, not gradually, not tentatively, but with the focused intensity of a man who has remembered why he built something and has decided that he will not let it be taken from him. He called a meeting of his senior lieutenants, the men and women who had watched him retreat into himself for 18 months, and he stood before them and spoke with the clarity and conviction that had made him formidable before Valentina's death. He did not mention the piano or the woman who played it, but the men who had known him longest could see the change, the return of sharpness to his eyes, the straightening of his spine, the reappearance of the strategic mind that had built the organization from nothing. Whatever had happened in the Ferraro estate, whatever had broken the spell of the boss's grief, the result was unmistakable. Dante Ferraro was back. Giancarlo recognized the shift immediately and responded with the desperation of a man who sees the window of his ambition closing. He moved faster than Dante had anticipated, making contact with rival organizations, offering alliances that would bypass Dante's authority, positioning himself as the rational alternative to a leader who had spent 18 months in mourning. He gathered 3 of the junior lieutenants to his cause, men who had been recruited during Dante's absence and whose loyalty was to Giancarlo's competence rather than Dante's legacy. The confrontation happened at the port warehouse, the operational center of Dante's logistics network. Giancarlo arrived with his supporters and presented what he called a proposal for restructuring, which was, in the language that powerful men use to dress violence and respectability, a demand for Dante to step aside. Dante listened. He sat at the head of the table in the concrete room, and he listened to Giancarlo's proposal with an expression that gave nothing away. And when Giancarlo finished speaking, Dante opened a folder that contained documentation of every unauthorized meeting Giancarlo had taken in the past 6 months, every contact with rival organizations, every financial irregularity in the accounts that Giancarlo had managed during Dante's absence. The documentation was thorough. It was precise. It was damning. And it had been compiled not by Dante's traditional intelligence network, but by Celeste, who had applied the analytical mind that had earned her a place at the Conservatoire de Lyon to the financial records that Dante had given her access to, and who had found patterns in the numbers the way she found patterns in music. Through careful attention, through the recognition of structures that repeated and varied, and ultimately revealed their underlying logic. Giancarlo looked at the documents. He looked at Dante, and he understood that the game was over, that the 18 months of patient maneuvering had been undone by a man who had returned from the dead and a woman whose existence Giancarlo had never considered relevant. Giancarlo was removed from the organization, not violently. Dante had learned, through his grief and through Celeste's influence, that violence was a blunt instrument and that precision was more effective and more sustainable. Giancarlo was given the choice to leave quietly with his reputation intact, and he took it, because the alternative was the exposure of his betrayals to men who would not be as measured in their response as Dante had been. He walked out of the warehouse with the rigid posture of a man who understood that he had gambled everything on a dying man staying dead, and the dead man had gotten up. He did not look back. He got into his car and drove north, and within a week he had left the city entirely. And within a month, the men who had worked under him had transferred their operations to Dante's direct oversight, and the vacancy he left had been filled so completely that his name stopped appearing in conversation altogether, the way a stone sinks into water and the surface closes over it as if it had never been disturbed. The junior lieutenants who had aligned with Giancarlo were given second chances. Dante understood that their disloyalty had been a response to his absence, not a judgment on his character, and forgiveness, strategic, conditional forgiveness, was more valuable than punishment. He met with each of them individually, in his study, the study where he had listened to Celeste play through the wall for weeks, and he looked at their faces and read their fear and their relief and their recalibrated loyalty. And he understood that leadership was not about never falling, but about what you did when you stood back up. He wrote to Gabriella, not a long letter. He was not a man of many written words, but an honest one. He told her about the music. He told her about the woman who played it. He told her that Valentina's piano was alive again, and the sound of it was not a wound, but a bridge, a connection to the daughter they had both loved, and that he had finally been able to sit in the music room and look at Valentina's photographs without the grief destroying him. Gabriella wrote back. She said she was glad. She said she'd been waiting for him to find something that made him want to live again. She said she was not coming home, but she was happy that home was becoming a place worth inhabiting. On the night after Giancarlo's departure, Celeste played the Rachmaninoff again. Not in secret, not through a wall, but in the music room with the chandelier lit and the photographs of Valentina restored to their places on the shelf and Dante sitting in the armchair by the window. She played with the door open, so the music traveled through the house, down the corridors, into the rooms where it had not been heard in 18 months, filling the estate with sound the way light fills a space when curtains are opened after a long darkness. When she finished, she turned on the piano bench and looked at Dante. He was not weeping this time. He was looking at the photograph of Valentina on the shelf, and his expression held something that grief had been blocking for 18 months, memory without destruction. He could look at his daughter's face and remember her without being annihilated by the loss, could hold the love and the absence simultaneously without one consuming the other. "She would have loved your playing," he said. Celeste smiled. She had excellent taste in pianos. "This Steinway is the most beautiful instrument I've ever played." "It's yours." "I can't accept. It's not a gift. It's a correction. That piano was built to be played, and you're the person who should be playing it." Valentina would agree. She was 7 years old, and she had better judgment than most adults I've met. She would have liked you. She would have asked you to teach her the French Lullaby. Celeste's eyes filled. She pressed her fingers against the keys without pressing them down, feeling the resistance, the potential, the music waiting inside the mechanism. "I'll teach it to the room then, and the room will remember it for her." In the weeks that followed, the estate began to change. It was subtle at first. Dante asked the day staff to open the curtains in the east wing, to let the sea light in, to stop treating the corridor like a restricted area. He had the photographs of Valentina returned to their places throughout the house, on the hallway table, on the mantelpiece in the living room, on the shelf in the kitchen where Celeste and Dante still shared tea at 2 a.m, though now the tea was often accompanied by conversation that lasted until 3, until 4, until the first gray light of dawn appeared in the kitchen windows, and Celeste had to reluctantly gather her things and catch the morning bus. He asked her to stop cleaning. She refused. "I am employed by the agency. I have a contract. I have a mother in a care facility in Marseille who requires payment every month. I cannot simply stop working because..." "Because what?" "Because you look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I am something more than a woman with a mop." "You are something more than a woman with a mop. You are a pianist who is wasting her hands on marble floors, and I won't stand for it." He arranged a position for her, not as a gift, not as charity, but as a correction, as he called it. He connected her with the music department at the university in the city, where a visiting instructor position had opened for the following semester. He did not pull strings so much as open doors, the way a man of his influence could open doors simply by indicating that he would appreciate them being opened. The position paid enough to cover her mother's care and her living expenses, and left her evenings free to play. Not in secret, not at midnight, but in the light, with the chandelier burning and the windows open and the sea air carrying the music out over the gardens and the cliffs and the water. Celeste moved into the guest suite on the second floor of the estate. She told herself it was practical. The apartment in the immigrant quarter was far from the university, and the estate had rooms that no one used. She told Amara and Lou with the appropriate apologies, and Amara hugged her and whispered, "About time," in a way that suggested she had understood something Celeste was only beginning to admit, and Lou nodded with the practical acceptance of a woman who would now have more room for her maritime law textbooks. 3 months later, Celeste performed at a small venue in the city, a converted warehouse with exposed beams and mismatched chairs and acoustics that were imperfect but honest. It was not the concert hall of Lyon. It was not the stages her professors had envisioned for her. But it was a stage, and she was on it, and she played with the full force of who she was. Not the cleaning woman, not the night maid, not the diminished version of herself that circumstance had created, but the pianist, the musician, the woman whose hands could translate grief and love and loss and hope into sound that entered other people's bodies and made them feel less alone. Dante sat in the front row. He sat beside an empty chair that he had placed there deliberately, a chair for Valentina, and the gesture was not sad but sacred, an acknowledgement that love does not end when the person you love ends, that the chair would always be there, that the absence was permanent, but so was the love. When Celeste finished playing, the program ending, as it always did with the lullaby, the room was silent for 3 full seconds before the applause began. In those 3 seconds, Celeste looked at Dante, and Dante looked at Celeste, and between them was everything. The wall they had communicated through, the tea they had shared at 2 a.m, the grief that had almost consumed him, and the loss that had almost erased her, and the music that had held them both together when nothing else could. He stood during the ovation. She saw him stand, and she saw the empty chair beside him, the chair that would always be there at every performance, in every room they shared, a permanent place, setting for a girl who would never grow up, but whose presence would never be erased. And she understood that he had given her something no audience could give. Not applause, not admiration, not the career she had lost, or the stages she had dreamed of. He had given her the knowledge that she had been heard, truly heard, by someone who needed the hearing as much as she needed the playing. He had given her the understanding that music is never wasted, even when it is played at midnight in a locked room to an audience of 1 through a wall, because the right note played at the right moment can save a life. And that is worth more than any concert hall. Thank you for staying with Celeste and Dante through every note of this story. Thank you for understanding that music can save a life, that grief doesn't have to be the end, and that sometimes the person who rescues you is someone you didn't even know was in the room. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their talent, no matter how buried, is never truly lost. Drop a comment and tell me what song has saved you. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the most powerful performances happen when you don't know anyone is listening. Keep playing.